I'll rewrite this historical account of the Battle of Midway for you, maintaining all the key details while presenting them in a different narrative style. Before the sun broke the horizon on that 4th day of June in 1942, Japanese aviators occupied the cramped cockpits of fighter planes and bombers positioned across the decks of 4 fleet carriers cutting through Pacific waters. Some received final instructions in briefing compartments, memorizing the features of their target shown on worn reconnaissance photographs. Meanwhile, maintenance personnel worked feverishly on aircraft that would soon participate in what everyone expected to be another triumphant operation. Nobody aboard these vessels knew that approximately 240 miles toward the northeast, a trio of American flat-tops had already positioned themselves to launch offensive strikes. Within mere hours, what Japanese planners conceived as the final elimination of American naval aviation in the Pacific theater would transform into the Empire's greatest maritime catastrophe. Those 4 Japanese carriers that had achieved such spectacular results at Pearl Harbor would descend into the ocean depths, carrying not merely metal and petroleum, but the ambitions of territorial expansion and more than 3,000 skilled personnel whose experience could never be duplicated. This represented the peak of half a year of continuous victories, and for the first time, this crucial engagement would be examined through the perspective of the defeated side, through the admirals who designed the operation, the aviators who executed it, and the seamen who perished during its execution. This was Midway. 2 months prior to the catastrophe, during the spring of that year, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, holding the position of Combined Fleet Commander, engaged in contentious discussions with naval general staff officers in Tokyo. The situation possessed complications invisible to ordinary citizens. The December assault on Pearl Harbor, despite its tactical excellence, had destroyed not a single American carrier. This fact consumed Yamamoto's thoughts constantly. Enterprise and Lexington had been conducting operations at sea when the attack occurred, and now, 6 months afterward, these vessels continued launching strikes against Japanese positions throughout the Pacific. Even more troubling, on the 18th of April, American medium bombers launching from Hornet had appeared above Tokyo itself. The Doolittle operation, though causing minimal destruction, represented an inconceivable disgrace for military forces sworn to defend the Emperor from any threat whatsoever. This raid created profound psychological shockwaves within Japanese command structures. The homeland's vulnerability had been demonstrated and accountability had to be assigned. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commander of the Pearl Harbor strike, felt particularly troubled. Critics blamed him for declining to authorize a 3rd attack wave at Pearl Harbor, for failing to locate the American carriers, and now the capital had suffered bombardment. Pressure for decisive action became overwhelming, yet Japanese Supreme Command remained characteristically fractured. Within official corridors, 2 conflicting approaches developed. The Naval General Staff, exercising traditional caution, supported continued southern expansion, consolidating territorial gains throughout the Solomon Islands and New Guinea, severing the connection between America and Australia. Yamamoto envisioned something entirely different, motivated by both perceived opportunity and quiet desperation. He understood what few others in Japan truly grasped. Time operated against them. His years spent in America, studying at Harvard and serving in diplomatic military positions, had provided first-hand observation of American industrial capacity. He had witnessed Pittsburgh's steel production facilities, Newport News shipbuilding operations, and vast agricultural regions capable of sustaining millions of industrial workers. Once American war production reached maximum output, Japan would face overwhelming material disadvantage. In documented conversations with Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoye during 1940, Yamamoto stated that if ordered to fight, he could guarantee aggressive operations for perhaps 6 months, but held no confidence regarding what might transpire if conflict extended 2 or 3 years. This assessment would demonstrate prophetic accuracy. Another verified statement from September 1941 contained his warning that Japan would initially enjoy unrestricted expansion in all directions, resembling an octopus extending its tentacles, but this advantage would persist perhaps 18 months at most. Yamamoto's proposed solution took the form of Operation MY, the invasion of Midway Atoll. These tiny islands, containing merely 6 square miles of coral and sand combined, possessed strategic value far exceeding their modest dimensions. Positioned 1,100 miles northwest of Pearl Harbor, Midway functioned as America's most western-positioned outpost, providing crucial refueling capabilities for submarines and aircraft conducting Central Pacific patrols. More significantly for Yamamoto's purposes, Midway would serve as irresistible bait-drawing American carriers from Pearl Harbor. When they arrived to defend the atoll, superior Japanese naval forces would annihilate them in the decisive engagement that Japanese naval theory had always anticipated, the Kantai-Kessen. The plan demonstrated considerable complexity, perhaps excessive complexity. Multiple forces would operate across thousands of miles of ocean simultaneously. An invasion force would seize Midway, carrier strike forces would eliminate American air power, the main body, including battleships and Yamamoto's flagship, the massive Yamato, would provide support, and diversionary attacks on Aleutian Islands would confuse American commanders. Approximately 200 vessels total, representing Japan's largest assembled fleet. The operation order alone consumed 700 pages, distributed mere days before departure, providing subordinate commanders minimal time for study. Opposition to this plan existed but ultimately proved ineffective. Rear Admiral Motome Ugaki, serving as Yamamoto's chief of staff, conducted war games during early May that produced disturbing outcomes. In tabletop exercises, American carriers appeared earlier than projected and inflicted substantial damage on Japanese forces. These results received arbitrary modification. Umpires reduced American hits and refloated Japanese ships designated as sunk during the exercise. When Lieutenant Commander Minoru Genda, the tactical genius who had designed the Pearl Harbor attack, expressed concerns regarding operational complexity and carrier vulnerability, his objections were dismissed. Victory disease, that dangerous overconfidence emerging from 6 months of easy conquests, had infected even the most capable minds within the Imperial Navy. Japanese intelligence estimated they had destroyed 2 American carriers at Coral Sea during May. Actually, only Lexington had been sunk. They assumed Yorktown sustained damage requiring months of repair work. Japanese intelligence failed to detect the emergency repair operations at Pearl Harbor, where 1,400 workers labored continuously to restore Yorktown to operational status within 72 hours, a feat Japanese shipyards could not have accomplished. They calculated Americans could deploy at most 2 operational carriers against them. Meanwhile, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, selected to command the carrier strike force, harbored significant doubts. Nagumo was not a carrier specialist by training or inclination. A torpedo warfare expert appointed to command 1st Air Fleet primarily through seniority rather than aviation expertise. He had never felt comfortable with naval aviation. At Pearl Harbor, his cautious approach had prevented a 3rd strike that might have destroyed American fuel storage and maintenance facilities. Now he faced leading an even more complicated operation with increasingly exhausted forces. His carriers had operated almost continuously since Pearl Harbor, striking Darwin and Ceylon while supporting operations from the Indian Ocean to the Coral Sea. His air crews were fatigued and vessels required maintenance. Most troubling, the recent Coral Sea engagement during May had cost Japan significantly. While tactically a Japanese victory with Lexington's destruction, strategically it represented setback. Carrier Shikaku suffered extensive damage requiring months of repair. Her sister Zuikaku had lost so many aircraft and pilots she could not participate in the Midway operation. 2 of Japan's finest carriers would be absent from the decisive battle. As Nagumo confided to his chief of staff, Captain Ryunosuke Kusaka, they were being asked to accomplish too much with insufficient resources. The Americans had enjoyed time to prepare. Their pilots were exhausted, and American carrier locations remained unknown. Yamamoto was gambling with the Empire's fate. Perhaps the most catastrophic flaw in Japanese planning involved intelligence and mentality. Unknown to Japanese commanders, Americans had penetrated the Japanese Navy's JN-25B code. Commander Joseph Rochefort's Station Hypo at Pearl Harbor had been decrypting Japanese communications since early 1942. Americans knew about Operation MY and identified the target. They knew the scheduled timing. The planned reconnaissance of Pearl Harbor by flying boats, Operation K, was cancelled when submarines found American warships occupying French frigate shoals, the intended refueling location. This had succeeded in March when 2 Kawanishi flying boats refueled there from submarines to bomb Oahu, but Nimitz had learned from that raid. Systematically, the observation capabilities that might have provided warning of the American ambush were being eliminated. Radio intelligence indicated increased American submarine activity and communications traffic around Midway. The ease with which Americans located Japanese forces at Coral Sea suggested potential code compromise, yet these warnings received dismissal. As one staff officer expressed it, Americans were too incompetent to break Japanese codes and too cowardly to fight without overwhelming superiority. They would approach Midway only after Japanese occupation and then face destruction. On May 27th, the anniversary of Admiral Togo's great victory over Russian forces at Tsushima, Nagumo's carrier strike force, the Kido Butai, departed from the inland sea. 4 carriers sailed: Akagi, meaning Red Castle, Yamamoto's former command and Nagumo's flagship; Kaga, Increased Joy, the converted battleship; Hiryu, Flying Dragon; and Soryu, Green Dragon. Collectively, they carried 248 aircraft, including 21 Zeros being transported to Midway, with 225 operational for combat, crewed by the world's most experienced naval aviators. These were the ships and personnel who had devastated Pearl Harbor, who had operated from Hawaii to Ceylon. Surely nothing could stop them. Commander Minoru Genda, still recovering from emergency appendectomy surgery but serving as Nagumo's air operations officer despite illness, made a final diary entry before departure. They sailed with troubled hearts. This operation had been rushed, intelligence was inadequate, and the plan demonstrated excessive complexity. But they were warriors. They would fulfill their duty even if it led to death. May the gods protect Japan, for he feared they sailed toward catastrophe. The fatal flaw of overconfidence appeared perhaps most clearly in the treatment of Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had commanded the Pearl Harbor attack. During late May, Fuchida underwent emergency appendectomy surgery aboard Akagi. The surgery left him too weak for flight operations, depriving Japanese forces of their most experienced strike commander at the most critical moment. According to later testimony from other officers, Fuchida observed preparations from his medical bed with increasing unease, sensing everything about this operation felt wrong. The timing, the plan, the atmosphere itself seemed heavy with approaching doom. However, historians note Fuchida's post-war accounts require careful evaluation, as modern scholarship has challenged many of his assertions. In pre-dawn darkness, on June 3rd, 600 miles northward, the Aleutian Islands operation commenced. Rear Admiral Kakuji Kakuta's second carrier strike force, with light carriers Ryujo and Junyo, launched strikes against Dutch Harbor in Alaska. This was intended as the Great Diversion, drawing American forces northward while Nagumo attacked Midway. Unknown to Japanese planners, Americans had not accepted the bait. Admiral Chester Nimitz, fully informed by codebreakers regarding the actual target, maintained his carriers at Midway. The elaborate deception had deceived only the Japanese themselves. Meanwhile, Nagumo's carriers steamed through fog toward their launch position, maintaining strict radio silence that would prevent coordination between widely separated forces. In ready rooms, aviators received final instructions. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, who would command the first strike, studied reconnaissance photographs of Midway one final time. The images were weeks old, showing the airfield, fuel storage, defensive positions. What they failed to show was recent island reinforcement, additional fighters, bombers, and most critically, the radar installation that would detect the Japanese strike while still 93 miles distant. That evening, American PBY Catalina flying boats spotted portions of the Japanese invasion fleet 700 miles west of Midway. This initial contact electrified American command. Navy pilot Ensign Jack Reed, flying a PBY, reported at 9:25 sighting main body bearing 262, distance 700. But Nagumo's carriers remained undetected, concealed by weather and distance. On Akagi's bridge, tension was palpable. Chief of Staff Kusaka approached Nagumo. If Americans had spotted the invasion force, they might demonstrate greater alertness than expected. Nagumo dismissed the concern. The invasion force was supposed to be observed. It would draw them out. Tomorrow would bring destruction of their Midway air power, and when their carriers arrived for counterattack, Japanese forces would be waiting. Yet even as Nagumo spoke these confident words, 300 miles toward the northeast, Admiral Raymond Spruance aboard Enterprise was plotting the Japanese carrier force's probable position. American carriers occupied exactly where they should not be, according to Japanese calculations. Already at sea, already positioned, already preparing to strike. Task Force 16 under Spruance with Enterprise and Hornet, and Task Force 17 under Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher with hastily repaired Yorktown had reached Point Luck, their designated meeting position northeast of Midway, undetected by any Japanese reconnaissance. Weather was clear, seas calm, perfect flying conditions with visibility extending for miles. At precisely 4:30, Akagi and Kaga commenced launching the first wave against Midway. Launch operations proceeded smoothly. 36 Aichi dive bombers, 36 Nakajima-level bombers, and 36 Mitsubishi Zero fighters. Lieutenant Tomonaga led them into the brightening sky, circling once above the fleet before heading southeast toward Midway, 240 miles distant. As the 108th aircraft formed up and departed, Nagumo made his first fateful decision. Despite doctrine calling for maximum impact through full deckload strikes, he retained 108 aircraft, Kates armed with Type 91 torpedoes and 800-kilogram armor-piercing bombs in case American vessels appeared. It seemed prudent, but would prove catastrophic. Below decks in Akagi's hangar, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida observed the launch from his sickbed, still recovering from appendectomy. The absence of his experience and tactical brilliance would be acutely felt in coming hours. According to witness accounts from other officers, Fuchida expressed deep concern about the operation, though his specific words remain unverified in contemporary documents. At 500 hours, Nagumo launched search aircraft, merely 7 planes to cover vast ocean expanses. By contrast, Americans had over 30 PBYs searching for the Japanese fleet. Most critically, the search plane from Heavy Cruiser Tone, designated Scout Number 4 and assigned to search the sector where American carriers actually were, launched 30 minutes late. Various sources attribute this to catapult problems, though some suggest engine trouble or bureaucratic delays. This single mechanical failure would cascade into catastrophe. Ironically, recent scholarship suggests that had the aircraft launched punctually, its search pattern might have missed American task forces entirely. At 5:34, PBY pilot Lieutenant Howard Addy spotted Japanese carriers and transmitted the electrifying message about enemy carriers. He followed with additional detail at 5:52 about 2 carriers and battleships bearing 320 degrees, distance 180 miles, course 135, speed 25. On Enterprise, Spruance made a command decision that would determine the battle's outcome. Despite extreme range, nearly 200 miles, he ordered immediate strikes. His aircraft would possess barely sufficient fuel for return, but he wanted to catch the Japanese during their most vulnerable moment, recovering their Midway strike. Meanwhile, at 5:53, Radar on Midway detected the incoming Japanese strike 93 miles out. Air raid warnings sounded across the tiny atoll. Every available aircraft scrambled. Bombers to attack the Japanese fleet. Fighters to defend. Marine fighters launched into the air. 20 obsolete Brewster Buffaloes and 7 Grumman Wildcats. They were outnumbered 4-1 by escorting Zeros. Interception occurred at 6:16. Marine Major Floyd Parks, commanding the defenders, made his final radio transmission about Hawks at Angels 14 supported by fighters. The massacre proved swift and brutal. Zeros, with superior maneuverability and experienced pilots, tore through the Marine formation. Within minutes, 13 Marine fighters were shot down, 4 severely damaged. Major Parks numbered among the dead. Zeros lost merely 3 aircraft. At 6:30, Tomonaga's strike force arrived over Midway. Dive bombers and level bombers executed attacks with precision, igniting fuel tanks, destroying buildings, cratering the runway. Yet as Tomonaga circled to assess damage, he observed something troubling. American aircraft continued taking off from the supposedly destroyed airfield. The runway, while damaged, remained operational. Most importantly, none of the American aircraft had been caught on the ground. They had all launched before the strike arrived. At 700 hours, Tomonaga radioed Nagumo that a second attack wave was necessary. This message reached Nagumo precisely as the first American strikes from Midway began arriving. First came 6 TBF Avengers and 4 B-26 Marauders carrying torpedoes. Zeros assigned to combat air patrol swarmed them. 5 Avengers were shot down, 2 B-26s destroyed. 1 B-26, nicknamed Susie Q, piloted by Lieutenant James Murray, made a desperate run directly at Akagi after releasing its torpedo. According to multiple Japanese witnesses, including bridge personnel, the bomber roared down Akagi's flight deck length, its gunners strafing and killing 2 sailors. The aircraft pulled up at the last second, barely clearing the bridge where Nagumo and his staff ducked for cover. Murray's aircraft sustained over 500 bullet holes and lost hydraulic fluid, but somehow returned to Midway. A second B-26, piloted by Lieutenant Herbert Mays and heavily damaged, actually crashed into the ocean near Akagi's bridge, possibly attempting deliberate ramming. This near miss produced profound psychological effect. As Captain Kusaka would later testify, the Admiral appeared visibly shaken. To have an enemy plane nearly crash into the bridge felt as if the war god had delivered a warning. Additional American attacks followed in rapid succession. 16 Marine dive bombers led by Major Lofton Henderson, who would be killed leading his squadron. 15 B-17s bombing from high altitude. 11 Marine Vindicators. All were repulsed with heavy losses, scoring no hits, yet they kept Japanese carriers dodging and weaving, unable to conduct flight operations efficiently. At 7:15, Nagumo faced a critical decision. His reserve aircraft were armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes for ship attack, yet Tomonaga needed support at Midway, and no enemy carriers had been spotted. After heated discussion with his staff, Nagumo issued the order that sealed his fate: remove torpedoes, load land attack bombs. This violated Yamamoto's explicit orders to maintain readiness for anti-ship operations. Down in hangar decks of all 4 carriers, chaos erupted. Ordnance crews began the laborious process of removing Type 91 torpedoes and 800-kilogram armor-piercing bombs, replacing them with smaller land attack munitions. Against regulations and safety protocols, removed torpedoes were stacked in hangar spaces rather than being returned to magazines far below. There was insufficient time. Bombs were piled near aircraft. Fuel hoses snaked everywhere as planes refueled. As one mechanic, Airman Mori, would later testify if he had survived, the hangar deck resembled a bomb factory where one spark would kill everyone. At 7:28, everything changed. Tone's delayed scout plane, number 4, finally reported sighting what appeared to be 10 enemy surface ships bearing 010 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway, course 150 degrees, speed over 20 knots. Nagumo immediately signaled to ascertain ship types. The response failed to arrive for 12 agonizing minutes. Meanwhile, rearming continued, hangar decks becoming increasingly cluttered with ordnance. At 7:45, another American strike arrived. 16 Marine dive bombers from Marine Scout Bombing Squadron 241, led by Major Henderson. Zeros savaged them, shooting down 8, but attacks kept coming, forcing violent evasive maneuvers preventing flight operations. Nagumo was trapped in an impossible position. His fighters were running low on fuel and ammunition from fighting off continuous attacks. Tomonaga's strike force would return soon, also low on fuel. His decks were spotted with aircraft being rearmed, and somewhere out there were American surface ships, possibly carriers. At 8:09, Tone No. 4 Scout finally clarified that enemy ships included 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers. Nagumo exhaled with relief, no carriers, and continued rearming for a second midway strike. Yet at 8:20, another message shattered his composure. The enemy is accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, commanding 2nd Carrier Division from Hiryu, immediately signaled Nagumo at 8:30 that he considered it advisable to launch attack force immediately. Yamaguchi, aggressive and decisive, perceived the danger clearly. Every minute of delay increased vulnerability. Yet Nagumo hesitated. His aircraft existed in chaos. Some armed with bombs, some with torpedoes, many not armed at all. His fighters needed to land and refuel. Tomonaga's returning strike was approaching. To launch now would mean a partial, uncoordinated attack without fighter escort, violating every principle of Japanese carrier doctrine. Commander Minoru Genda, despite illness from appendectomy, was consulted. According to staff officer testimonies, he argued for immediate launch, that speed was everything now, launch what they possessed. But Captain Kusaka counselled caution. If they attacked piecemeal, they would suffer heavy losses for minimal gain. Better to recover their aircraft, properly arm them, and launch a fully constituted strike according to doctrine. Nagumo, always cautious, always adhering to established procedures, sided with Kusaka. They would recover Tomonaga's force, rearm and refuel properly, then strike with full strength. He signalled all carriers that after completing aircraft recovery, they would proceed north to engage the enemy. This decision, logical, prudent, and completely wrong, sealed the Kido Butai's fate. As Tomonaga's planes landed starting at 8:37 and were struck below for refueling and rearming, hangar decks became death traps. Fuel lines were everywhere. Bombs and torpedoes were scattered about. Constant cycling of elevators brought planes up and down. Safety protocols were completely abandoned in the rush to prepare for launch. Nobody noticed the first American torpedo planes appearing on the horizon until too late. At 9:20, the first American carrier aircraft arrived. 15 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers from Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron. Without fighter escort, flying obsolete aircraft at merely 100 knots barely above the waves, they bore in against the entire Japanese fleet. Zeros on combat air patrol, finally with worthy targets after hours of fighting off land-based attacks, descended like hawks on pigeons. The massacre proved total. One by one, slow, vulnerable torpedo bombers were shot down. All 15 were destroyed. Of 30 aircrew, only one survived, Ensign George Gay, who would float in the water hiding under his seat cushion, watching the rest of the battle unfold. Not a single torpedo hit. Yet Waldron's sacrifice was not meaningless. Zeros were all drawn down to sea level, focused on torpedo planes. At 9:54, 14 Devastators from Enterprise's Torpedo Squadron 6 arrived, led by Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay. Again, Zeros swarmed down. 10 were shot down, 4 escaped, no hits. At 1000 hours, 12 Devastators from Yorktown's Torpedo Squadron 3 attacked, led by Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey. 10 more shot down, still no torpedo hits. Of 41 torpedo bombers that attacked, only 6 survived. It appeared another slaughter for nothing. On Akagi's bridge, there existed relief, even celebration. American attacks had been repulsed with terrible losses. Nagumo ordered the strike force to prepare for launch at 10:30. Victory seemed within grasp. Yet high above, unnoticed with every zero at sea level, 2 groups of SBD Dauntless dive bombers arrived simultaneously. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading 33 dive bombers from Enterprise, had searched beyond his calculated interception point, gambling his fuel to find the Japanese. He had spotted destroyer Arashi speeding north after depth-charging submarine Nautilus and followed its course directly to the Kido Butai. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie's 17 dive bombers from Yorktown arrived from a different direction at the same moment. At 10:20, lookouts on Akagi screamed about Helldivers, but it proved too late. With zeros at sea level, with decks packed with fueled and armed aircraft, with bombs and torpedoes scattered throughout hangar spaces, Japanese carriers were perfectly vulnerable. At 10:22, McCluskey pushed over into his dive from 14,500 feet. Behind him, his squadrons rolled into their attack dives. Rising sun insignia on carrier decks below grew larger, becoming perfect targets in the crystalline Pacific morning. Lieutenant Commander McCluskey led his bombers against Kaga, while Lieutenant Richard Best took his division against Akagi. Almost simultaneously, Leslie's Yorktown bombers plunged toward Soryu. Japanese carriers, recovering from violent evasive maneuvers and with decks crowded with aircraft, were caught at their most vulnerable moment. On Kaga, 4 bombs struck in rapid succession. The first, a 1,000-pounder, exploded near the bridge at 10:22, killing Captain Jisaku Okada and most of his command staff instantly. The second struck the flight deck amidships, penetrating to the hangar deck where fueled aircraft exploded in chain reactions. Third and fourth bombs turned the ship into an inferno. Within minutes, Kaga was a floating torch with ammunition cooking off and aviation fuel creating walls of flame. Akagi received merely 1 direct hit at 10:24 from Lieutenant Best's bomb, yet it proved sufficient. The 1,000-pound bomb penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the upper hangar among 18 aircraft being refueled and rearmed. Induced explosions of improperly stored ordnance proved catastrophic. Torpedoes detonated, bombs exploded, aviation fuel created unstoppable conflagration. Bridge personnel reported that within 2 minutes, the entire hangar deck was an inferno with temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius. Soryu suffered 3 direct hits in her hangar spaces at 10:25. Lieutenant Leslie's bombers placed their ordnance with deadly precision. 13 Vals, 3 Zeros, and 4 Kates on the flight deck were blown apart. Below in hangars, stacked torpedoes and bombs created secondary explosions tearing through the ship's vitals. Her captain, Ryusaku Yanagimoto, refused to abandon his burning vessel. According to testimony of Chief Petty Officer Abe, who was sent to rescue him, Yanagimoto was last observed on the bridge, sword in hand, singing the national anthem Kimigayo as flames engulfed the command structure. Only Hiryu, separated from the others by several miles and screened by clouds, escaped. Admiral Yamaguchi immediately prepared counterstrike, but 3/4 of Japan's carrier striking power had been eliminated in 5 minutes. At 10:58, even as 3 carriers burned, Yamaguchi launched 18 Val dive bombers and 6 Zero escorts led by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi. Following American aircraft return track, they located Yorktown at 1200 hours. Despite fierce resistance from Wildcat fighters and anti-aircraft fire, they scored 3 bomb hits, leaving the American carrier dead in the water, burning and listing. Damage control parties worked frantically and incredibly. Within 2 hours, Yorktown was underway again, making 20 knots. Yamaguchi, aggressive to the end, immediately prepared a second strike. At 13:31, only 10 Kate torpedo bombers and 6 Zeros were available, led by Lieutenant Tomonaga. During the morning midway strike, Tomonaga's left-wing fuel tank had been damaged. Maintenance crews only had time to fuel his right tank. Offered opportunity to switch planes, Tominaga refused, stating every aircraft was needed. He knew it was a one-way mission. His fuel would only last for the attack run. At 14:30, Tominaga's small force found Yorktown, now making 19 knots after heroic damage control efforts. American fighters tore into the formation. Tominaga held his course despite his plane catching fire from fighter attacks. According to American witnesses, his burning aircraft maintained its torpedo run until the very last moment, releasing its torpedo before crashing into the sea. 2 torpedoes hit Yorktown at 14:45, tearing open her port side and causing 26-degree list. This time, damage proved fatal. Yet at 1700 hours, 24 dive bombers from Enterprise found Hiryu. 4 bombs turned her into another inferno at 1703. Yamaguchi assembled his crew on the tilting flight deck. According to survivors, he apologized for the defeat, urged them to survive and rebuild a stronger navy, then retired to his bridge with Captain Tomeo Kaku. Both chose to descend with their ship. Their bodies were never recovered. Yamaguchi's final message to Nagumo included apology for the defeat and hope for the Emperor's fortune in war. He received posthumous promotion to Vice Admiral. Through the night of June 4th to 5th, surviving Japanese ships attempted damage control, but it proved hopeless. Soryu sank at 1913 on the 4th with 711 personnel. Kaga followed at 1925, taking 811 sailors to the sea. At 0:25 on June 5th, Yamamoto, still 600 miles distant aboard flagship Yamato with the main body that never engaged, finally accepted reality. He signaled that occupation of Midway was cancelled. Withdraw. Akagi proved surprisingly difficult to destroy. Despite raging fires, she remained afloat through the night. At 0500 on June 5th, after all surviving crew evacuated, Japanese destroyers torpedoed her. She sank at 0500, taking 267 men to depths over 17,000 feet. Hiryu succumbed at 0900 on June 5th after burning all night. 392 personnel died with her. At 0900 on June 5th, Hiryu descended in water over 17,000 feet deep. As the sun rose on June 5th, the elite of Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier force rested on the Pacific bottom in water exceeding 17,000 feet depth. With them were 3,057 personnel. Of these, 2,181 died on carriers. Akagi lost 267, Kaga 811, Hiryu 392, Soryu 711. Another 792 died on heavy cruisers when Mikuma was sunk, 700 dead, and Mogami damaged, 92 dead, after they collided during night operations and were caught by American aircraft. Crucially, only 110 were aircrew. Most pilots were rescued. The greater irreplaceable loss was over 700 skilled aircraft mechanics and flight deck personnel whose expertise had required years to develop. Survivors picked up by destroyers were immediately segregated from the rest of the fleet to prevent news of the disaster from spreading. They were confined below decks, forbidden to communicate with anyone. The disaster was not quite finished. On June 6th, Submarine Ruddy 168, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, found the crippled Yorktown under tow by Vireo. Tanabe had been off Midway providing weather reports and had observed the morning attacks through his periscope. Now, slipping through the destroyer screen at 3 knots, he achieved what the entire Kido Butai could not. At 13:31, Tanabe fired a spread of 4 torpedoes from 1,200 yards. 2 hit Yorktown, 1 hit destroyer Hammond, alongside providing auxiliary power. Hammond broke in 2 and sank in 4 minutes with 80 dead, many killed by her own depth charges exploding. Yorktown, hit by 2 more torpedoes, was doomed but refused to sink immediately. She finally rolled over and sank at 0701 on June 7th in approximately 16,650 feet of water. This small consolation, sinking the carrier that had helped destroy the Kido Butai, barely registered against the scale of Japanese defeat. Meanwhile, heavy cruisers Mogami and Mikuma, attempting to bombard Midway on the night of June 4th, had collided while avoiding submarine attack. American aircraft found them on June 6th. Mikuma was sunk with 700 personnel, the highest death toll of any Japanese ship at Midway. Mogami, heavily damaged with 92 dead, barely made it back to Truk. The disaster was complete. The journey home was one of shame and silence. Wounded sailors from carriers were kept isolated in special compartments. Nobody was allowed to speak of what happened. When the fleet returned to Japan at Hashirajima Naval Base on June 14th, they anchored at night to avoid observation. Wounded were offloaded in darkness, classified as secret patients, and taken to isolated naval hospitals where they were kept under virtual arrest, quarantined even from their own families. They were forbidden any contact with the outside world. According to United States Naval Institute sources, they were treated appallingly as disgraced losers. Survivors of air groups were immediately reassigned to distant bases in the South Pacific without being allowed to see families or friends. The majority would die in subsequent battles of the Solomon Islands campaign. Carrier crews were dispersed to different ships and bases, sworn to secrecy under threat of severe punishment. Systematic cover-up began immediately. Government prepared its propaganda. Sunken carriers Akagi and Hiryu remained on official rosters as active to maintain the fiction they still existed. No flag officers were court-martialed or even officially reprimanded, as this would require admitting defeat. Information about the defeat was withheld from the Imperial Army. Even Prime Minister Hideki Tojo was kept in darkness about the full extent of disaster. On June 5th, while ships still burned, Tokyo Radio announced to Japanese people that naval and air forces of the Empire had succeeded in inflicting heavy damage on American fleet and air forces in the Central Pacific. Later broadcasts added that Japan had achieved another smashing victory with 2 American carriers sunk. Loss of 1 carrier, Kaga, was acknowledged, with Soryu's loss admitted later. Akagi and Hiryu's destruction would not be publicly acknowledged until after the war. Japanese people celebrated in streets, unaware they were cheering catastrophe. Only on June 10th did Tokyo press first hint at problems, using vague language about difficulties in the war. Admiral Yamamoto returned to his cabin aboard Yamato and failed to emerge for 3 days. His staff heard him pacing at night, tortured by his failure. To his diary, he confided thoughts only discovered after the war. According to staff officers who served with him, Yamamoto fell into deep depression, knowing the war was now unwinnable. His prediction to Prime Minister Konoye had proven prophetic. Japan had indeed run wild for 6 months, exactly as he had foreseen. Now, at Midway, occurring precisely 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the tide had turned. In private meeting with his staff, documented by Captain Kuroshima, Yamamoto was brutally frank. He had gambled and lost. In trying to destroy American carriers, he had lost Japan's own. The war was not lost yet, but he feared he had lost the means to win it. To his close friend, Rear Admiral Teikichi Hori, he would later write a letter that survived the war, expressing that defeat at Midway was not matter of bad luck or enemy superiority in numbers, but result of Japanese overconfidence and poor planning. They underestimated American capabilities and overestimated their own. Now they would pay the price for hubris. He gave Japan perhaps 18 months before the situation became completely hopeless. His prediction would prove optimistic. Within 18 months, Japan would lose the Marianas, and American bombers would be within range of home islands. The true cost of Midway extends far beyond 4 carriers and 3,057 dead. Japan lost over 100 of its best pilots, personnel with years of training and combat experience from China to the Indian Ocean. The pilot training program, requiring 2 years minimum to produce combat-ready aviators and far longer to create experts, cannot replace them. More critically, The 700-plus skilled aircraft mechanics, armourers, and flight deck crew who died represent institutional knowledge that took decades to develop. These personnel knew every rivet of their aircraft, every quirk of their carrier's operations. As Admiral Ugaki writes in his diary, later captured and translated, they could build new carriers in 2 years, but could not build new pilots with the experience of those lost and would never replace skilled maintenance crews who knew how to keep aircraft flying under combat conditions. The real tragedy of Midway is not the ships, but the personnel. Japanese naval aviation never recovered. At Battle of Philippine Sea 2 years later, in June 1944, inexperienced Japanese pilots would be massacred in what Americans call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese naval aviators flying against veteran American pilots in superior aircraft lost over 600 planes while inflicting minimal damage. The seeds of that disaster were planted in waters off Midway. Midway marked the end of Japanese expansion. Within Imperial General Headquarters, reality slowly penetrated despite propaganda. Planned invasions of Fiji, Samoa, and Hawaii were quietly cancelled. Proposed Operation FS to sever supply lines between America and Australia was abandoned. Instead, Japan was forced into defensive war it could not win. Americans, their confidence soaring, began planning counter-offensive. Guadalcanal, merely 2 months away, would begin the long, bloody American advance toward Japan. The psychological impact proved equally devastating. Japanese Navy's aura of invincibility, carefully cultivated, was shattered forever. As one destroyer captain, Commander Tameichi Hara, recalled in memoirs, after Midway they never felt confident again. They entered battle expecting to lose. Americans entered expecting to win. The whole psychology of war had changed in those 5 minutes when carriers were hit. Within the Navy itself, bitter recriminations began immediately, though never publicly. Admiral Nagumo, made scapegoat for defeat despite following orthodox doctrine, was relegated to shore duty. He would never command carriers again. In 1944, during American invasion of Saipan, where he commanded ground forces, he committed suicide rather than face capture. Admiral Ugaki writes in his diary that Nagumo was finished as commander. Blame must fall on someone, and it could not be Yamamoto. The defeat also exposed fundamental flaws in Japanese military culture. Inflexibility of thinking, inability to adapt to unexpected situations, blind adherence to doctrine even when circumstances changed. All these cultural traits contributing to defeat were recognized but could not be changed. The same rigid hierarchy and thinking that led to disaster at Midway would be repeated throughout the war. Post-war analysis reveals the cascade of failures leading to disaster. Japanese operation was too complex, with forces scattered across thousands of miles unable to support each other. Radio silence, maintained religiously, prevented coordination when plans went awry. Intelligence was abysmal. Japanese had no idea American carriers were already at sea, while Americans knew every detail of Japanese plans thanks to code breaking. Failure of reconnaissance proved particularly damning. Only 7 search planes to cover vast ocean area compared to over 30 American PBY Catalinas. Cancelled Operation K reconnaissance of Pearl Harbor due to American presence at French frigate shoals. Submarine cordon arriving too late to detect American carriers. Tone's No. 4 search plane launching 30 minutes late due to mechanical problems. Japanese underestimated American capabilities while overestimating their own. They assumed Americans could not break codes, yet they had. They assumed Yorktown could not be repaired quickly, yet she was fixed in 72 hours. They assumed American pilots were inferior, yet at Midway, American dive bomber pilots proved devastatingly effective. They assumed American carriers would arrive after Midway was captured, yet they were waiting in ambush. Damage control failures proved equally telling. Japanese carriers with enclosed hangar decks and inadequate firefighting systems became death traps when hit. American carriers with open hangar decks and superior damage control proved far more survivable. Yorktown absorbed tremendous punishment and might have survived except for submarine attack. Japanese carriers burned catastrophically from single hits due to poor fuel system design and inadequate ammunition handling procedures. Admiral Yamamoto did not long survive the defeat he knew doomed Japan. On April 18, 1943, American codebreakers intercepted his travel schedule. P-38. Lightning fighters intercepted his aircraft over Bougainville and shot it down. His death, exactly 1 year after the Doolittle raid that had precipitated Midway, seemed almost poetic justice. Found in jungle, still strapped to his seat, sword at his side, Yamamoto took to his grave full knowledge of how Japan lost the war in those 5 minutes at Midway. Before his death, in one of his last letters to a friend that survived the war, Yamamoto reflected with remarkable clarity that at Midway they learned wars are not won by spiritual strength alone, but by intelligence, both kinds, good information and wisdom to use it properly. They had neither. They were too proud to believe Americans could be waiting, too rigid to adapt when plans went wrong, too arrogant to admit codes might be broken. Pride preceded fall, and their pride was limitless. The result was inevitable. The greatest irony of Midway is that it achieved Yamamoto's goal just in reverse. It was indeed the decisive battle he had sought, but it was Japan, not America, that was decisively defeated. Carriers he had tried to trap had instead trapped him. The ambush he had planned became the ambush he suffered. The decisive battle doctrine that Japanese naval strategy had been built upon for 40 years was proven correct, but it was Americans who won it. As documented in Japanese military archives, Yamamoto had genuinely feared American industrial might. In early 1942, he told his staff, "A military man can scarcely pride himself on having struck a sleeping enemy. It is more matter of shame, simply, for the one struck. He would rather they made appraisal after seeing what the enemy does, since it is certain that angered and outraged, he will soon launch determined counterattack." At Midway, that counterattack arrived with devastating efficiency. Americans had not only recovered from Pearl Harbor, but had turned Japanese strategy against them. The war would continue 3 more years, but its outcome was effectively decided in those 5 minutes on June 4, 1942. Beyond strategic implications, Midway was fundamentally human tragedy. In waters 325 miles northwest of Midway, 3,057 Japanese sailors and airmen died. Young personnel who had written final letters to families that morning, who had shared rice and tea for breakfast, who had dreams of victory and home. They died in flames reaching 1,000 degrees, drowned in oil-slicked waters, or were torn apart by explosions audible miles away. Lieutenant Hashimoto, one of few survivors from Akagi's engine room, testified at post-war investigations that screams of burning personnel echo in nightmares still. They could not save them. Passages were blocked by fire, ladders melted from heat. They could only listen as they died, voices calling for mothers, for water, for death to end agony. Every night he hears them still. Families back home never learned truth during war. They received notices their sons died gloriously for Emperor in great victory. Mothers hung gold stars in windows, proud of sacrifice, never knowing it was for defeat that sealed Japan's fate. Truth would only emerge after war, adding betrayal to grief. Many families refused to believe it even then, so complete had been deception. Petty Officer Tanaka, who survived Soryu's sinking, recalled the morning before battle. They were so confident, joking about which American ship they would sink. Yamada said he would sink a battleship. Suzuki claimed he would shoot down 5 American planes. They were both 18 years old. Both died when bombs hit. Their bodies were never recovered. Sometimes he wonders if they're still down there, standing at their posts, waiting for orders that will never come. Today, the 4 Japanese carriers rest in over 17,000 feet of water, their exact locations only recently discovered by deep-sea explorer Robert Ballard and subsequent expeditions. They are war graves, monuments to the price of hubris and cost of war. Aircraft that once launched from their decks to spread destruction across Pacific lie crumpled in hangar bays. Bones of their crews remain at battle stations, eternal guardians of ships that will never sail again. From Japanese perspective, Midway represents the moment when dreams of empire collided catastrophically with reality. It was proof that spiritual strength alone cannot overcome material weakness, that courage without intelligence leads to disaster, that rigid thinking cannot adapt to fluid situations. It was Japan's appointment with destiny, and destiny proved merciless. Midway defeat shattered more than ships and lives. It shattered illusions. Myth of Japanese invincibility. Faith in spiritual superiority over material strength. Belief that determination could overcome any odds. All died with carriers. In their place came grim recognition that Japan had started a war it could not win against an enemy it had fatally underestimated using strategies modern warfare had rendered obsolete. Yet from ashes of defeat came different Japan, one that renounced war, embraced democracy, and became force for peace and prosperity. Samurai spirit that once drove conquest now drives innovation. Nation that once sought to dominate Pacific now helps maintain its peace. Technological expertise that once built carriers now builds automobiles and computers. In that transformation, perhaps the 3,057 who died at Midway did not die entirely in vain. The battle also stands as warning to all nations about dangers of overconfidence and rigid thinking. Japanese military, despite tactical brilliance and brave personnel, fell victim to its own success. Victory disease, assumption that what worked before will always work, that enemy will act as expected, that superior spirit will overcome material disadvantage, infected decision-making at every level. Same Navy that had brilliantly executed Pearl Harbor attack 6 months earlier now bungled basic reconnaissance, ignored intelligence warnings, and walked into trap that should have been obvious. As we examine Midway from Japanese perspective, we see not villains but human beings caught in terrible machinery of war. Young pilots who flew to their deaths with courage, if not wisdom. Commanders making decisions with incomplete information under impossible pressure. Mechanics working frantically to prepare aircraft they would never see again. Sailors fighting fires that could not be controlled, staying at posts until the end. Their story deserves telling not to glorify defeat or war, but to remember cost of military aggression and price of imperial ambition. Lieutenant Commander Fuchida, despite questions about his post-war reliability, perhaps captured something essential when he became Christian evangelist after war and spent remaining years preaching reconciliation. Though his specific accounts must be treated cautiously, his transformation from architect of Pearl Harbor to advocate for peace represents the journey Japan itself took, from aggression to pacifism, from empire to democracy, from isolation to international cooperation. The lesson of Midway from Japanese perspective is ultimately that no nation, no matter how powerful, can afford to underestimate enemies, overestimate capabilities, or ignore changing realities of warfare. Same carriers that seemed invincible at Pearl Harbor proved fatally vulnerable at Midway. Same pilots who had swept all before them met their match in American dive bombers. Same strategies that worked against divided enemies failed against united and informed opponent. In the end, waters that closed over Japanese carriers at Midway were same waters that would eventually wash away militarism that sent them there. Young personnel who died believed they fought for emperor and empire. They could not know they were actually dying for birth of new Japan, peaceful, prosperous, and democratic. Their sacrifice, though tactically meaningless and strategically disastrous, helped demonstrate futility of military aggression and impossibility of sustaining empire through force. This is Battle of Midway from Japanese perspective, story of pride before fall, of human error compounding into catastrophe, of young lives sacrificed for strategic miscalculation. Its story deserving telling not to celebrate defeat or victory, but to remember cost of war and price of empire. For in the end, waves that closed over Japanese carriers at Midway were same waves that would eventually wash clean stains of militarism, leaving behind nation transformed and lesson for all humanity that path of aggression leads only to destruction, and true strength lies not in conquest, but in peace. The ghosts of Midway, Japanese and American alike, remind us war is not glorious but terrible, not triumphant but tragic, and that peace, however difficult to maintain, is always preferable to even most decisive victory. In vast Pacific, where carriers still lie in their deep graves, the only sound is eternal movement of waves carrying neither Japanese nor American voices, but simply echo of humanity's costliest lesson, that war, no matter who wins, leaves only loss in its wake.